Greetings. I'd like to spend a few minutes mentioning a few points about the McMartin preschool trial. This was one that took place in Manhattan Beach, California in the 1980s, and this is often used as an example of what can go wrong in a child sexual abuse case and also what happens when there's community panics. Much of the material I pulled out of our book when teachers, clergy, and caretakers sexually abuse children and adolescents. First, I'd like to back up for a moment and briefly mention that this case falls into the satanic and cult related sexual abuse theme. And even though some of the allegations seem outrageous or if impossible, they still brought much fear into the community. And investigating any cult related case, whether it's a homicide or sexual abuse case, is extremely complex. And there are all kinds of issues that one has to address, including the legal aspects of the case, also the politics, the community fears, the risks of false allegations multiplying, and obviously societal reaction itself. One example I would mention to think back to historically would be the Salem witch trials and the hanging of women who were accused of being witches. And so think about how your community would react if they believed that there was a cult operating in the area that were sexually abusing kids or killing kids or something of that sort. And you could see how this panic would occur. And Erickson, in his book Wayward Puritans, does a historical and sociological analysis looking at the Salem witch trials in the 1600s, looking at some of the symptoms of being a witch. In other words, they looked for certain body parts. They had certain tests. For example, if they tied rocks around someone, threw them in the river, and they sank, they were considered to be a witch. They would believe that these witches could create havoc for others and the like. In other words, the legal system at that time constructed a witch profile. We obviously know that these women were killed and were innocent victims of a panic that became deadly. Well, the California McMartin case, as I mentioned from the 1980s, really shows the perils and pitfalls of investigating alleged cult related activities. And as I mentioned before, that so many mistakes were made that books and articles have been written more so as warnings to others who might investigate these types of cases. Certainly, the media did not help, nor the public. And in this particular case, the initial satanic ritual abuse allegations against the preschool teachers were developed and reported by a mother who was apparently suffering from a variety of illnesses, including major mental disorders, based on press and court accounts. And it is alleged by DeYoung that she coached her child to make statements that led investigators and the community to believe that multiple children were being sexually abused at the daycare center in a variety of bizarre ways. And this led the law enforcement officials to send out a letter to the other parents asking them to ask their children about this. And all of a sudden, it seemed like there were all these children that had been sexually abused, and then they were sent to a, um, uh, a particular treatment program that specialized in interviewing sexually abused children. Unfortunately, the community panic had taken hold in that center, and a lot of the interviewing was conducted in a very poor manner, asking leading questions and creating even more of a panic in that sense, which the media additionally fueled. And after 28 months of trial costing 13 million, the defendants were acquitted and the charges were dismissed, as DeYoung points out in one of the articles I cited. In addition to the problems in the investigation with the interviews, you had the media, you also had grassroots groups and professionals fueling this moral panic with all kinds of misinformation. So you had problems with interviews with the alleged victims, problems with interviews with the alleged perpetrators, problems with witness interviews, problems, as you'll see from reading some of the documents, crime scene evidence collection. One of the interesting features was this whole idea of these secret tunnels under the preschool where they had satanic cult related ceremonies and abuse occurring. And you can read about those allegations and the whole history. Some of the specific interviewing problems that have been noted, and this could lead to false allegations, would be poorly repeated interviewing. In other words, repeating interviews, interviewing these children over and over and over again, also interviewing them and conducting suggestive questions, coaching them, projecting the interviewer's own beliefs onto what they expect to have answered. You know, in other words, encouraging the children to answer in a particular way. Poor interdisciplinary communications between organizations, the misuse of information by the press and other organizations, and also the presentation of shocking behavior, which became problematic. Holmes and Holmes, in their criminal profiling book in 2009, point out that in satanic rituals you have often particular items and behaviors, and they mention a lot of these. And a few of these were brought into the McMartin allegations, but certainly if you look, it doesn't appear that it appears there were more bizarre statements about flying in airplanes and children turning into animals and things of that nature, just fantasy, almost with a cartoonish type description, behavior which would be impossible, and other behaviors which would certainly be bizarre and easily discovered. And so if you read about some of those allegations or some of the statements that were made, you can realize that the public had a clear problem differentiating fact from fiction, or I should say, fact from fantasy. If we were to look at cults, we would perhaps look at Singer's work in 2003, Cults in Our Midst, published by Jossie Bass Publishers. And Singer recommends that if we're trying to analyze if cults exist, we first want to see if there's an origin of the cult and a role of a particular leader, and if there's a power structure, methods of persuasion and thought control, for example. And we didn't have that here if you carefully assess, and that's another feature, that if this case was going to be investigated as a sexual abuse case, that's what it should have been investigated as, allegations of sexual abuse, not as satanic cult related abuse. Because really, I think what happened is the public, the press, and the community created this idea of cult related sexual abuse. So it's always important to differentiate if there's some type of satanic rituals going on, or actually I would take the satanic out of there and just say ritual sexual abuse in that sense. And so I put some other information on the PowerPoint about thought reform and some other features that you might see in cults that were not present in the McMartin case. And also the whole idea of cults as countercultures, looking at Zellner's earlier work, which is now classic, and this whole idea of a conspiracy, and this has led to all kinds of problems that continue. And Erickson really, I think, wraps up the statement by saying that many of the institutions designed to discourage deviant behavior actually operate in such a way to perpetuate it, from page 14 in Wayward Puritans. And this wraps up this video.